Hi guys, it's Miss Portillo. I am going to go ahead and do our next section of Chapter 2 for our Wrinkle in Time novel study. I hope you've been annotating and taking notes. I want to do a quick summary and just go over what we've heard and remember so far. So our story started out with Meg and her family. There was a storm, a hurricane. Meg couldn't sleep. She was troubled by people talking about her family and her dad missing, people thinking her baby brother was dumb. She also has two other brothers, and then her mom. Again, dad is missing. Um, and then Miss Whatsit came for a late night visit in the middle of the storm. And the next day, Charles and Meg, after school, decided to go see Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. And so they went with their dog Fort for a trip and a walk through the woods. And they ran into another boy there named Calvin. Two important things that we've learned because the story's starting to get really interesting. One thing is that Charles Wallace seems to have this innate ability to read people. And we discussed in the last video what that meant. Predict what they want or what they're going to say. And then what we learned about this boy that just ran into Calvin is that he seems to, he says, have a compulsion or a desire, a need to go be somewhere or do things sometimes. So they're still in the woods talking to him. They have not made it to Miss Whatsit's house yet. They're still talking to Calvin right now. So that's where we're going to pick up for today. All right. Uh, Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for a moment. Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. At last Charles Wallace said, "Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you'd better come home with us and have dinner." "Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that?" Calvin asked. "She'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right." "What about Meg?" "Meg has it tough," Charles Wallace said. "She's not really one thing or the other." "What do you mean, one of us?" Meg demanded. "What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other?" "Not now, Meg," Charles Wallace said. "Slowly. I'll tell you about it later." He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a quick decision. "Okay, let's take him to meet Miss Whatsit. If he's not okay, she'll know." He started off on his short legs toward the dilapidated old house. The haunted house was half in the shadows of a clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast, which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else creaked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around to the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked, and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave its raucous cry, and a woodpecker went into a wild rat-a-tat-tat. A large gray cat scuttled around the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. "They get a lot of fun out of using all the typical props," Charles Wallace said. "Come on, follow me." Calvin put a strong hand to Meg's elbow, and Fort pressed against her leg. Happiness at their concern was so strong in her that the panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the house without fear, so they made her feel better. They entered into a sort of a kitchen. There was a huge fireplace with a big black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled. How did it smell? I can turn the page. It smelled more like one of Mrs. Murray's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Mrs. Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Mrs. Whatsit's two friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. Charles Wallace went up to her. I really don't think you ought to have taken Miss Buncombe's sheets without consulting me, he said, as cross and bossy as only a very small boy can be. What on earth do you want them for? The plump little woman beamed at him. Why, Charlesy, my pet, le coeur a ses raisons que la raison point. French. Pascal. The heart has its reasons, whereof reason knows nothing. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said crossly. Your mother would find it so. A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of the spectacles. I'm not talking about my mother's feelings about my father, Charles Wallace scolded. I'm talking about Miss Buncombe's sheets. The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I think you'd have guessed. If we have to frighten anybody away, what's it thought we ought to do it appropriately? That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Aufrischer tat Tat. German. English. As I was saying, but Charles Wallace held up his hand in a peremptory gesture. Mrs. Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed. Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name. Mrs. Who will do, the woman said. He wasn't my idea, Charlesy, but I think he's a good one. Where's Mrs. Whatsit? Charles asked. She's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy, getting near time. And he's a very good man, Charlesy, darling. But right now, he needs our help. Who? Meg demanded. And little Megsy, lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. The time is not yet ripe. Don't worry, we won't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Trust in us. Shoo! And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed them out the door with surprising power. Charles, Meg said, I don't understand. Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fort ran on ahead, and Calvin was close behind them. No, he said, I don't either. Yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know as soon as I can. But you saw Fort, didn't you? Not a growl. Not even a quiver. Just as though there weren't anything strange about it at all. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk about it until we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly. Lead on, moron, Calvin cried. I've never even seen your house, and I have the funniest feeling that for the first time in my life, I'm going home. Chapter 3, Mrs. Witch. So that's the third friend. We have Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch. Now that's not spelled W-I-T-C-H like a Halloween witch. It's spelled W-H-I-C-H like which one would you like? Okay, remember those multi-meaning words. In the forest evening was already beginning to fall, and they walked in silence. Charles and Fort gamboled on ahead. Calvin walked with Meg, his fingers barely touching her arm in a protective gesture. This has been the most impossible, the most confusing afternoon of my life, she thought. Yet I don't feel confused or upset anymore. I only feel happy. Why? Maybe we weren't meant to meet before this, Calvin said. I mean, I knew who you were in school and everything, but I didn't know you. But I'm glad we've met now, Meg. We're going to be friends, you know? I'm glad too, Meg whispered, and they were silent again. When they got back to the house, Mrs. Murray was still in the lab. She was watching a pale blue fluid move slowly through a tube from a beaker to a retort. Over a Bunsen burner bubbled a big earthenware dish of stew. Don't tell Sandy and Dennis I'm cooking out here, she said. They're always suspicious that a few chemicals may get in with the meat, but I had an experiment I wanted to stay with. This is Calvin O'Keefe, Mother, Meg said. Is there enough for him too? It smells super. Hello, Calvin. Miss Murray shook hands with him. Nice to meet you. We aren't having anything but stew tonight, but it's a good thick one. Sounds wonderful to me, Calvin said. May I use your phone so that my mother will know where I am? Of course. Show him where it is, will you please, Meg? I won't ask you to use the one out here if you don't mind. I'd like to finish up this experiment. Meg led the way into the house. Charles Wallace and Fort had gone off somewhere else. Outdoors, she could hear Sandy and Dennis hammering at the fort they were building up in one of the maples. This way, Meg went through the kitchen and into the living room. I don't know why I call her when I don't come home, Calvin said, his voice sounding bitter. She wouldn't notice. He sighed and dialed. Ma? He said. Oh, Hinky, tell Ma I won't be home till late. Now don't forget, I don't want to be locked out again. He hung up, looked at Meg. Do you know how lucky you are? She smiled rather wryly, not most of the time. A mother like that? A house like this? Gee, your mother's gorgeous. You should see my mother. She had all her upper teeth out, and Pop got her a plate, but she won't wear it, and most days she doesn't even comb her hair. Now, not that it makes much difference when she does. He clenched his fists. But I love her. That's the funny part of it. I love them all, and they don't give a hoot about me. Maybe that's why I call when I'm not going to be home, because I care. Nobody else does. You don't know how lucky you are to be loved. Meg said in a startled way, I guess I never thought of it like that. I guess I just took it for granted. Calvin looked somber. Then his enormous smile lit up his face again. Things are going to happen, Meg. Good things. I feel it. He began wandering, still slowly, around the pleasant, if shabby, living room. He stopped before a picture on the piano of a small group of men standing together on a beach. Who's this? Oh, a bunch of scientists. Where? Meg went over to the picture. Cape Canaveral. This one's father. Which one? Right here. The one with the glasses? Yep, the one who needs a haircut, Meg giggled, forgetting her worries in her pleasure at showing Calvin the picture. His hair is sort of the same color as mine, and he keeps forgetting to have it cut. Mother usually ends up doing it for him. She bought clippers and stuff because he won't take the time to go to the barber. Calvin studied the picture. I like him. Looks kind of like Charles Wallace, doesn't he? Meg laughed again. When Charles was a baby, he looked exactly like father. It was really funny. Calvin continued to look at the picture. He's not handsome or anything, but I like him. Meg was indignant. He is too handsome. Calvin shook his head. Nah, he's tall and skinny like me. Well, I think you're handsome, Meg said. Father's eyes are kind of like yours too, you know, really blue. Only you don't notice his as much because of the glasses. Where is he now? Meg stiffened, but she didn't have to answer because the door from the lab to the kitchen slammed and Miss Murray came in carrying a dish of stew. Now, she called, I'll finish this up properly on the stove. Have you done your homework, Meg? Not quite, Meg said, going back into the kitchen. Then I'm sure Calvin wouldn't mind if you finish your homework before dinner. Sure, go ahead. Calvin fished in his pocket and pulled out a wad of folded paper. As a matter of fact, I have some junk of mine to finish up. Math. That's one thing I have a hard time keeping up in. I'm okay on anything to do with words, but I don't do as well with numbers. Mrs. Murray smiled. Why don't you get Meg to help you? But see, I'm several grades above Meg. Try asking her to help you with math anyhow. Well, sure. Here, but it's pretty complicated. Meg smoothed out the paper and studied it. Do they care how you do it? She asked. I mean, can you work it out on your own? Well, sure, as long as I understand and get the answers right. Well, we have to do it their way. Now look, Calvin, don't you see how much easier it is if you did it this way? Her pencil flew over the paper. Hey, Calvin said, I think I get it. Show me once more on another one. Meg's pencil was busy. All you have to remember is that every ordinary fraction can be converted into an infinite periodic decimal fraction. See? So 3/7 is 0.428571. And if you didn't understand that, I would say it sounds like Meg is quite smart at math. He's several grades above her, and she had no problem figuring it out whatsoever. This is the craziest family, Calvin grinned at her. I suppose I should stop being surprised by now. But you're supposed to be dumb in school, always being called up on the carpet. Oh, I am. The trouble with Meg and math, Miss Murray said briskly, is that Meg and her father used to play with numbers, and Meg learned far too many shortcuts. So when they want her to do problems the long way around to school, she gets sullen and stubborn and sets up a fine mental block for herself. Are there any more morons like Meg and Charles around? If so, I should meet more of them. All right, guys, we're going to stop there for today. Kept it kind of short for you today. Um, Make sure that you're continuing to take notes. And again, next time we will continue chapter 3 and we will summarize what we've read in the previous chapters. And I hope you can tell there's been a little bit of foreshadowing in this book. It seems like something is going to happen, something that involves Meg, Charles, and now Calvin, and also the Mrs. Miss Who, Miss What's It, Miss Which. And again, this is chapter 3. We're on Mrs. Which. And they were talking about going somewhere because when the kids left and Mrs. Who shooed them out of the house, the haunted house, she said that don't worry, I'm not going to leave without you. So it sounds like something's going to happen. So it's starting to get really interesting, and I hope you guys will stay tuned and continue to watch my videos. And I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and safe, and enjoying the time with your family and loved ones. I'll see you next time.